Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to get started. To those of you who've been with us, welcome back. I want to welcome members of the Harvard Graduate School of Education community, our faculty, staff, and students who have joined us for this special presentation. We're thrilled to have John King with us today. And I'm about to read what's a very impressive bio. You won't get a more impressive bio. But I do want to say in advance of that what I love, and I've had the opportunity to introduce John before to different audiences. In introducing him, it's not just the sort of standard, this is a very high-achieving national leader in the work that we do, but this is also just a great person, just a wonderful person, somebody who you'd love to have as your best friend, somebody who you would entrust your children's care to, somebody who in the way he conducts his life and his person and his style is somebody who we all very much admire and aspire to be like. So, John, thank you so much for joining us. But I have to read the bio just because it's incredible. John B. King Jr. is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. King served as the U.S. Secretary of Education from 2016 to 2017 as a member of President Barack Obama's administration. Before becoming Education Secretary and beginning in January 2015, King carried out the duties of the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education, overseeing all policies and programs related to P-12 education, English learners, special education, and innovation. And then there's a gap in the bio here, which doesn't say that he was Chief State School Officer for the state of New York, which is a considerable achievement that most people would put at the top, but apparently it's just, it isn't even here. But King began his career in education, and we can take some local credit for this, we're proud to say, as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico and Boston, Massachusetts, and as a middle school principal. And he was a key player in the founding of the Roxbury Prep Charter School in Boston. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in government from Harvard University, a JD from Yale Law School, as well as a Master of Arts in Teaching of Social Studies and a doctorate in education from Teachers College at Columbia University. King's life story is an extraordinary testament to the transformative power of education. Both of King's parents were career New York City public school educators whose example serves as an enduring inspiration. Both of his parents tragically passed away from illness by the time he was 12 years old. He credits New York City public school teachers, particularly educators at PS 276 in Canarsie and Mark Twain Junior High School in Coney Island, for saving his life by providing him with rich and engaging educational experiences and by giving him hope for the future. It is our real privilege to have John King on our stage today.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you, Paul, for that very, very kind introduction. It's a privilege to be here with all of you, and it's a privilege to be a part of this effort that you're leading, Paul. You have been an inspiring example in all of your leadership roles, and I'm just thrilled to be here. It's always good to be back at Harvard. My wife is a Harvard Ed School alum, so I spent a lot of time here when she was here, and I went to undergrad here as well, so it's always good to be back here, and deeply admire Dean Ryan, and I know he will be missed as he moves on to his new role, but admire his leadership here. So where I want to start, and maybe this is because I'm a high school social studies teacher, I'm going to start with current events. I'm going to start with putting our discussion this morning in some context. Last week, I was at Cardozo High School in Washington, D.C., meeting with kids in middle school and high school. I'll tell you what they told me. The first kids I asked about this current moment talked about being Somalian and her family not being able to visit and not being able to travel because of the travel ban that's been directed against people of Muslim faith. Another group of students are eligible for the DACA program, which allows young people who are brought here as children to continue their education and enter the workforce. And they're scared. They're scared about being deported. They're scared about their families being deported. Every single one of the kids talked about their fear of violence. Violence in the community in DC, and the violence that they see on television happening around the country. That's the context in which we have our conversation today. We also have the conversation today in the context of an administration that has proposed a budget that would eliminate federal funding for teacher professional development, a budget that would eliminate federal funding for after-school and summer programs, eliminate funding for the AmeriCorps program, cut student aid. That's the context for our conversation. We also have this conversation at a moment when civil rights enforcement is under assault. The administration has already withdrawn protections for transgender young people, undermined protections for LGBTQ folks across agencies, is attacking affirmative action, has reversed long-standing tradition of following civil rights complaints by investigating patterns and practice of discrimination, and has gone backwards on the efforts we made in the Obama administration to try to tackle the problem of campus sexual assault. That's the context for our conversation. Context for our conversation is that young people throughout the country watched on TV as the KKK and Nazis marched across a college campus. And as the 45th President of the United States struggled to condemn those Nazi and KKK marchers, but had no hesitation in conveying his anger and directing his anger at athletes who are protesting police violence. Right, that's the context for our conversation. And so the conversation today is about education, it is about community change, but it is also about conveying to all of our young people at this moment when they may feel under threat, that they are loved, that they are cared about, that we see them, that they belong, and that we will make school a place that is safe and supportive for them. So this is a community of people gathered to figure out how schools and communities work together to protect young people and to expand opportunity for them. Part of what unites all of us here today is our collective commitment to ensuring that every child has the full range of opportunity in life, can succeed in college and careers and as citizens, and can make of their lives what they will. This work is urgent because of the political challenges we face as a country, but it is also urgent because for really throughout our history, those who need the most have gotten the least. Kids who need the most have gotten the least. They've gotten less effective teachers, less access to advanced coursework, less access to resources, less access even to fundamentals like school counselors. We showed at the Department of Education in our Civil Rights Data Collection Survey, we have 1.6 million young people who go to school today where there is a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. Think about the message that that sends to young people about what we expect from them and what we expect for them. This conversation is urgent because of the achievement gaps that we see, whether you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress or state tests or graduation rates. We see a chronic achievement gap for low-income students, for students of color, for English learners. And those achievement gaps can be traced directly to opportunity gaps, the things we don't provide to students at school and outside of school. This is also a community that's gathered on the principle that to make change requires everybody working together and requires lifting up community voices. Right? I know that Paul is committed to the principle, nothing about us without us. Right? That's what drives this community. How do we bring everybody's voice to the table to try to improve outcomes for young people? And finally, this is a community that understands that we have to reject the false dichotomy, that it's all about school or it's all about what happens outside of school. Kids are whole people. And so school matters immensely, and what happens outside of school matters immensely. And I know that, as Paul mentioned, from my own life experience. I grew up in New York City. I went to New York City public schools. In October of my 4th grade year, my mom passed away. I was 8. And I lived with my dad, who was quite sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. And so for 4 years, until my dad passed away when I was 12, it was just the two of us in the house. And I didn't know from one night to the next what my father would be like. Some nights he was angry, some nights he was sad, some nights he would talk to me, some nights he wouldn't. As he got more and more sick, I took on more and more responsibility in the house. I had to figure out how to get food, how to do the laundry, how to keep the household going, how to pay bills. And I would sit a lot of times in school and worry about him, worry about our house, wonder why he acted the way that he did. I couldn't be a kid outside of school. But I was blessed, and I'm alive today and standing here today because I had amazing New York City public school educators who saved my life, who made school a place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. I had a teacher in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. Right? You notice when Paul read my bio, it's true, I skip over a lot of professional things, but I make sure to mention PS 276 and Mark Twain Junior High School because those teachers are the reason I'm here today. I had a teacher, Mr. Osterwald, he looped with us in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And he was the kind of teacher, you finished a book, he was there with the next, you finished a math problem, he had another one for you that was a little more challenging. In his classroom, we read the New York Times every day. I always say we were doing college and career ready standards before they were called college and career ready standards. Right? 4th, 5th, 6th grade, New York Times every day. I remember we had a part of that class was you had this assignment where you had to study a particular country. And I had the Soviet Union. It was during the Cold War, and so there weren't that many articles. But I've been thinking a lot about this because, you know, Russia is occasionally in the newspaper these days. But so I had the Soviet Union, there weren't that many articles, and the task in class was you had to summarize all the articles about the country that you were covering. And I remember, like yesterday, the day I walked into the classroom with this little table by the door of the classroom where the New York Times would be stacked up. I remember the day I picked up my New York Times and the leader of the Soviet Union had died. And there was a banner headline about that, and every article on the front page, I knew I had to summarize, was about the death of the leader of the Soviet Union. You know how the New York Times, they have at the bottom, like, turn to page A7? So I turned to page A7, open it wide. Every article along both sides is about the leader of the Soviet Union. I had to summarize every one of those articles. But every academic achievement I've had, I trace back to that kind of work that we were doing in Mr. Osterwald's classroom in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. We also did productions of Midsummer Night's Dream and Alice in Wonderland. I was the Rose in Alice in Wonderland. Imagine me with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. Right? But I remember that like it was yesterday. Those were transformative experiences. We went to the ballet and to the Museum of Natural History. He just showed us this whole world outside of Canarsie, Brooklyn, that I never would have known existed. Right? So I understand deeply the difference that all of you can and do make in the lives of young people. Schools save lives every day. Right? So when people say, well, school doesn't matter. I mean, if the kids are struggling at home, there's nothing school can do. I know they're wrong. I prove they are wrong. Right? But I also understand that when kids are hungry, when kids are homeless, when kids are in a family where there is substance abuse or domestic violence, that gets in the way of school. That's why I say we have to reject the false dichotomy that the choice is work on school or work on things outside of school. We have to work on both together. And so that's really where I want to focus our conversation today. What do we do in both venues? What do we do in both places to expand opportunity for young people? So let's start with school, right? And a vision for what school can and should look like. We have to begin, as we think about school, with quality early learning. The research evidence is overwhelming. Right? James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, will tell you the return on investment is 8-to-1, 9-to-1 for high-quality pre-K. So we have to start there, making sure that every child, regardless of income, has access to high-quality early learning, which really begins at birth. But at a minimum, we should ensure access to high-quality pre-K for our 3- and 4-year-olds. And we have to invest in quality. Right? Quality doesn't just happen. We have to make the investment. At the education department, we did a study that showed in many places around the country, pre-K teachers make half of what they would make if they worked in an elementary school in the district. Half. Many places, pre-K teachers make less than you would make doing nails. Now, I understand nails can be important. I'm not trying to slight that. What I am saying is that given the brain research, given what we know about the difference that quality early learning makes, we are not setting ourselves or our kids up for success by poorly compensating early learning teachers. That poor compensation drives tremendous turnover and prevents us from getting the kind of quality results that we would want. We also have to be vigilant about looking for quality and giving pre-K sites continuous feedback. I can recall visiting a pre-K in Queens who just had their quality rating and improvement system visit. And there were two things they took away from the visit. One was how important it is to have a language-rich environment, right? And so they were working on trying to coach their teachers around that language-rich environment. The other big piece of feedback that they got was that kids needed to wash their hands more frequently. And I said, even though I'm a parent, I said, yeah, that seems like a good idea, but why is that a big deal? And why is that on the quality review? And they pointed out that what they found was that when they built in routines that had students wash their hands more frequently, kids got sick less, and kids were in class more. But this pre-K was located in a K-5 building with lots of siblings in the K-5 school. Changing the routines around hand washing, and I watched the routine. I watched the kids line up, and they knew they had to take 2 squirts of the soap and how long to turn their hands under the water. Changing the routine around hand washing improved attendance not only in the pre-K, but in the entire school. Right? So that's about adult behavior. And we go back to this question of can we do things that make a change in kids' lives? That's just about the adults. Pre-K kids are happy to follow the routine. Right? So small change in adult behavior produce better attendance in the whole school. And we all know, even the most effective teacher can't be effective with a kid who isn't in the classroom. Right? So we've got to be focused on quality and early learning. In K-12, we've got to be focused on ensuring a well-rounded and well-resourced education. It can't just be about English and math. Right? Students need science and social studies and art and music. Right? And opportunities to engage in gym and physical education, opportunities to learn about health, right? Everything we would want for our own children, we should want for all children. We wouldn't want none of us in this room would want our kids only to have English and math all day, right? And so why would we wish that on anyone else's child? We have to insist on a well-rounded education for all kids, and that includes access to advanced coursework. We showed at the Department of Education that in our Civil Rights Data Collection Survey, low-income students and students of color are disproportionately likely to go to high schools where you can't even take chemistry or physics or algebra 2. Now imagine, we say we want a workforce ready for STEM, and yet we have students who can't even take the classes that are prerequisite to go on to study STEM subjects in college. So we need high-quality pre-K, we need a well-rounded, well-resourced education in K-12. We also need to make sure that we have a quality teacher workforce that is well-prepared and well-supported. We have to make sure that kids have access to school counselors. We have to make sure that kids have access to extended learning opportunities. Right? All the things that affluent schools and affluent communities would insist on, we need to make sure are available to all of our kids. We also need to make sure that kids have the opportunity not only for academic development, but socio-emotional development. Right? And that we are addressing their socio-emotional needs in school, and that we are integrating socio-emotional learning with academic learning. Right? Socio-emotional learning isn't a period. It isn't a workshop. It isn't a thing you do once a month. Oh, I'm going to socio-emotional learning today. Right? It doesn't work like that. But when you're engaged in a project with your classmates, right, when you're building a science project over time and getting feedback and improving that project, those are also building your socio-emotional learning skills. When you're engaged in a peer mentoring program with younger kids, that's building your socio-emotional skills. It's not a separate thing. It's got to be integrated into kids' learning experience. We also need to make sure that our schools are safe and supportive environments for all kids. And we have to acknowledge how this moment is undermining that. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a survey of K-12 educators this year, asking about school climate, the climate around bullying and harassment. They found that 8 out of 10 educators reported heightened anxiety among LGBTQ students, among African American students, among Muslim students, and immigrant students. And 4 out of 10 educators don't believe that their school has a system in place to respond to incidents of hate and bias. Right? So part of ensuring that our kids have the support they need in school is making sure that school is a place that is safe for them, where they have a sense of belonging, and educators are saying they need more help and support around that. One of the places that plays out is around exclusionary discipline. We know, for example, that African American students make up 18% of students in pre-K and 48% of students who are suspended or expelled from pre-K. In our K-12 system, we know from that same civil rights data collection that African American students are 3 times as likely as white students to be suspended from school. Right? And think about those schools that have the law enforcement officer but no school counselor. In those schools, the response to trauma is law enforcement. The response to mental health needs is law enforcement. And that creates the school-to-prison pipeline, which we know dooms young people to involvement in the juvenile justice system and then the adult criminal justice system. We need to do a better job ensuring that schools have the mental health services resources, the school counseling resources, but also that teachers have training around restorative justice, around alternatives to exclusionary discipline. We also need to tackle the issue of implicit bias and acknowledge that all of us as Americans have implicit bias. It's not about accusing people of being racist. It's about acknowledging the role that bias plays in our culture and our society. Think about the study done at Yale that showed pre-K teachers, black and white, watching video of student behavior, same behavior from all the kids, but identified the behavior of the African American male students as requiring intervention, but not the behavior of the white female students. And that issue of bias then affects how teachers interact with students, what messages they convey to students. We can tackle that. We also know that there's training that can be done to build empathy. For example, there was a recent study that showed that just getting a note from the teacher saying, "I believe you could be successful in an AP class," increased AP participation. Right? It matters what messages kids hear from the adults around them. We also know there's work to be done to ensure that teachers can deliver culturally responsive or culturally competent teaching. And Gloria Ladson-Billings would describe that as having 3 components. One, ensuring that there's strong academics. It's not about culturally responsive stuff other than instruction. It's about culturally responsive instruction. So we start with high-quality academics, but then developing kids' cultural competence and understanding of who they are and an understanding of other people's cultures. Right? And then it is also about developing their socio-political consciousness. Right? Do they understand the presence of injustice in our society? And can we cultivate the tools so that they can challenge that injustice? Right? That's the work we need to do around creating safe and supportive school communities. So, high-quality pre-K, well-rounded, well-resourced K-12 education, safe and supportive school communities, and diverse school communities. We know that students who have the opportunity to attend schools that are socioeconomically and racially diverse do better academically. Right? For sure, we have decades of research evidence that shows that low-income students will do better academically if they attend school with more affluent peers, and their more affluent peers at a minimum will do no worse academically. But we also know that attending diverse schools builds empathy, reduces bias, right? And we also know that all of our kids will occupy a world, a professional world, and a civic life that will be diverse. And we need to prepare them for that. And there's work that we can do to ensure that our schools are diverse. The Century Foundation did a study recently showing 100 different districts and school communities around the country that are engaged in school diversity work. It is possible. It is doable. Doesn't mean it's perfect anywhere. Cambridge is a good example. Cambridge has a long history of intentional socioeconomic integration. It means the schools do not have some of the worst concentrations of poverty, but everyone in Cambridge schools would acknowledge there's work to do to ensure equitable opportunity within those racially or socioeconomically diverse schools. But we can't get there if we don't start. We can't get there if we don't acknowledge that more than 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we have many communities around this country that are more segregated now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. In fact, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who writes for the New York Times, has written powerfully about the ways in which we defend and preserve school segregation. There are places in New York City where the schools are more segregated than the housing. Right? So when people say, well, it's all about housing, no, it isn't. It's about choices we make about school assignment. She's also shown this emerging trend of the white affluent sections of county systems seceding. Seceding. And it's important we use that word, seceding, right? Because there's a tradition in this country around secession, and is a tradition about undermining justice through secession, and that is exactly what is happening in those communities. We also know that there's work to do to ensure that our educator workforce matches the diversity of our students. Majority of kids in America's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African American men. At the Ed Trust, we just did a study in New York showing that there are tens of thousands of students of color who are in school districts and schools where they will never see an educator of color, because there are none. Yet, we also know from the Johns Hopkins research on a very large data set in North Carolina that elementary school students, African American elementary school students having just one African American teacher are more likely to graduate from high school. We also know African American teachers are less likely to suspend or expel African American kids and more likely to refer them for gifted and talented programs. But this isn't just about students of color seeing educators of color in their schools and classrooms. It's also about white students having the opportunity to see role models and mentors of color in their classrooms and schools. It is hard to believe that African Americans are inferior if you are learning calculus from an African American teacher. Right? And so there's work to do in schools. But then I want to turn to the work that we need to do outside of school. And I want to suggest 3 areas of focus that I know many in this room are already engaged in. But I want to reinforce their importance. First, the work on wraparound services informed by data. And that is an important component. In the Obama administration, as you know, we made a significant investment in promised neighborhoods. And we made that investment because we understood that schools would be strengthened and kids' lives would be improved if there was better coordination between the different institutions that serve them, better coordination between health, social services, and educators. And we see progress around the country in many of those promised neighborhood programs. I had the opportunity to visit last year our Indianola promised neighborhood in rural Mississippi, where students are already showing better preparedness for kindergarten through early learning literacy support that's being provided through the promised neighborhood. I had the opportunity to sit with parents who were in counseling sessions that were focused on both parenting skills and helping them navigate the job market so they could find good employment. We look at the promised neighborhood in San Antonio, where they focus particularly on issues affecting young men of color in the community and trying to improve the relationship between young men of color in the community and the police in San Antonio through joint activities, including joint athletic activities. We think about the work of the Boston Promised Neighborhood program at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and the work that they're doing, the progress that's been shown at the Orchard Gardens School, the work that they're doing to address the challenges that come with student homelessness and housing insecurity. But even as we celebrate those good examples, we have to redouble our efforts around better use of data. And I want to give you 4 examples. It's actually a great NPR story about Iceland today and the work that is happening in Iceland to reduce substance use by teens. And one of the researchers they talked to said, you want your data like your produce, which I liked. You want your data like your produce, you want it to be fresh and local. I thought that was pretty good. So we need to use data to drive improved coordination. 4 examples. It's an effort called Building Assets, Reducing Risk. It was started by a school counselor in Minnesota, but now is being replicated all over the country. It's a program that's won 2 Investing in Innovation, I3 grants, to scale their activities. The program is very straightforward. The idea is to have teachers and counselors within the school meet to talk about the kids who are most at risk. Very simple. They look at attendance, they look at behavior, they look at course performance, and then as a team, develop strategies to intervene with those students. Their tagline is same teachers, same students, different results. And they're showing that just by having the educators in the school working together, intervene with those students who are struggling, they've improved academic outcomes and improved graduation rates. Right, so that's just using the data within a school to make sure that the adults are coordinating their activities. I think about the work that's happening with the Success Mentors program that Bob Balfans at Johns Hopkins has worked on. There, the idea is students should be matched with mentors. We know there's research evidence to support that mentors make a difference for kids, but one of the things we can equip the mentors with is information about the kids who are chronically absent so that they can respond when kids are missing school. Right? And so the idea behind Success Mentors is the mentor may either help encourage you to be in school or may help connect you with the resources and services that might help resolve the issue that is keeping you from being in school. But the critical step is the mentor needs to know if you've been in school. Right? So it's a small example of smart data sharing. A 3rd example is around summer, both summer learning loss and summer jobs. So Teresa Rodriguez is here, who worked with me at Roxbury Prep. She's going to hate that I'm mentioning her. But she worked with me at Roxbury Prep, and one of her jobs as a teacher at our school was to make sure that every kid had a productive thing to do every summer. Right? A small thing, maybe. But actually, we know that summer learning loss has a huge role in the achievement gaps that we see. Some have argued that by 5th grade, kids who have not had quality summer learning experiences are 2 years further behind because of the lack of summer learning experiences. Imagine, we have mayors who are leading great work, including in Oakland, in this room. Imagine if a mayor said, in my city, every kid is going to have a productive activity every summer, and we're going to track which students are placed where, and we're going to make sure that we create those summer opportunities for every kid. Right, just like Teresa would do at Roxbury Prep. Now, we were small middle school, just trying to make sure every kid was productively engaged. But we could combat summer learning loss by ensuring that kids have those quality summer enrichment experiences. Same for teens. We know there's research evidence that suggests that teenagers who have access to summer jobs programs are less likely to be incarcerated and less likely to die. You heard that right. Research evidence that suggests that in high-needs communities where there is violence, the kids who are involved in summer programs are less likely to be killed in that violence. Now, we don't know exactly why, but we have hypotheses around peer effects, but also hypotheses around their meaningful engagement and sense of self that comes from having that job and knowing that there's another way to earn money than through illegal activities, and having a sense of what it would look like to be an unemployed adult. What if we made sure that every teenager in the community had summer employment? What if we were so diligent that we had every kid from K through 12, and we focused on ensuring that every one of them was productively engaged every summer? How different would communities be? That's about data, but also using data to drive decision making. A fourth example is around post-secondary transitions. Every year, so at the U.S. Education Department, we also oversaw higher ed. Every year, American students leave billions, with a B, billions of dollars on the table because they did not complete the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA. So we've done a lot of things to make it better. We moved the FAFSA date up. We made it possible to get information directly from your tax return to populate the FAFSA. But what if every school and every community was laser focused on ensuring that every student had completed the FAFSA? Louisiana is doing this and showing that through careful attention to FAFSA completion, they have more students who are finding out what aid they can get and therefore are more likely to go on to college. Tennessee is also engaged in this work as part of their Tennessee Promise effort. Right? But there's an opportunity there, just a very small step to make sure that students complete the FAFSA. Anytime I'm in a high school, one of the questions I ask the principal, how many seniors have completed the FAFSA? This is a knowable data point and a place where we can make a difference. Similarly, around post-secondary transitions, we know that many students say they're going to college in the spring, but don't end up enrolling in college in the fall. We can do something about that. Actually, the Strategic Data Project here has done a very thorough paper on the different activities that folks are engaged in around the country to challenge summer melt, to make sure that students who say they're going to college actually do, by matching them with counselors and peer mentors over the summer, by using text messaging, prompts, to make sure that they do the things they need to enroll in college and get into their courses and get their dorm, if they're going to be living in a dorm, or get their travel arrangements made. So there's all the work that we can do around better leveraging data. Two other points. Healthcare. We have this emerging body of evidence around the powerful impact of access to healthcare for academic and long-term life outcomes. We know that children who have access to Medicaid through Medicaid expansion over the last 2 decades are more likely to succeed in school, more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go on to college. We also know emerging data shows that if their parents have access to Medicaid, the kids benefit. There's a spillover effect that parents who have access to health care are more likely to make sure that their kids go to their health care appointments. It's one of the reasons why ensuring family access to health care is so critical. And at this moment, when the Affordable Care Act is under threat, whether it's by attempts to repeal or attempts to defund the Affordable Care Act, we've got to make sure that we are all activists on behalf of access to health care. We know that when students get that health care, it improves life outcomes. There's an effort by the Superintendents Association, the Children's Defense Fund, just to make sure that as part of the enrollment process at the beginning of the school year, families are reminded to enroll in health care and given the information not only about getting their kids health care, but getting health care for their families. We also know that health care can make a difference in core academic activities. There was just a study done in Baltimore on the importance of glasses and students having glasses. So I'm sure everyone will be shocked to learn that if you can't see the board and can't read the book, it's a problem for your educational success, right? We know that we can make a difference there. A program in Baltimore is showing significant reading gains just from making sure that kids have access to vision services. Last point around the work that we can do on the community side in support of better school outcomes is around 2-generation programs. We know that for many families, lack of access to English can be a force that traps them in poverty. And we can address that for both parents and kids. And there are programs around the country that are making sure that parents have access to English instruction that will help them in the job market, just as their kids are getting the academic support they need to build their English skills. In many ways, quality early learning is also a 2-generation program. Access to quality early learning can be a passport to the workforce for parents and family members. There are also programs that are working at the college level. I know we have folks here from Kentucky. One of the models I love is this new building that's been opened, the Eastern Scholar House in Kentucky. The idea being that low-income college students who are parents should be able to have someplace they can live with their child, get access to child care, and be able to afford housing. Sarah Goldrick-Robb at Temple has shown the huge challenge we have in higher education around housing insecurity and food insecurity. In fact, in a survey of community college students, she showed that a third of students were hungry and 14% of students were homeless. Right? But we can do something about that. And to the extent that we can do that for our students who are parents, we are benefiting them and their children simultaneously. So there's work we can do in schools, there's work we can do in the community, but most importantly, there's work that we have to do together to give people a sense of hope and purpose. I'll close with this. President Obama would often quote Dr. King and his famous saying that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. These days, it's feeling especially long. But President Obama was always quick to add that we have to be the ones to do the bending. Right? It doesn't happen on its own. We have to be engaged in the work to bend it. The work that you're doing to build community, to better serve young people and families, is the work of bending the arc of the moral universe. So I'm grateful to be with you all to celebrate that work, to urge you to redouble your efforts, and to tell people the story of the work. People need reasons to be hopeful and optimistic. And too often they are awash, whether it's on cable news or the alerts on their phone, awash in all the things that are wrong. But I believe, as President Clinton used to say, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. There's nothing broken about our country that can't be fixed by people like the people in this room working to bend that arc of the moral universe. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and happy to take questions. Yes, Mayor.
When we were in our little group, I said that my number one challenge was real-time diagnostic data. For example, we just got data about college matriculation that is 2 years old, and that was the fastest we could get it. What are some examples? Can you go a little deeper into how we can get our data like produce?
Yes. Well, some of it requires change in law and change in policy. So one challenge we have in the higher ed space is that we ought to have a student unit record. We ought to have a way that we can track all students through higher ed so we have a better understanding of higher ed outcomes to inform the work we're doing in K-12 and also to inform higher ed policy. But there's been a resistance to that. There is a bipartisan bill now in Congress around a student unit record that would help, particularly on the specific issue you're raising around college matriculation. I find often that in institutions, people collect a lot more data than they use and share effectively, right? So take the issue of chronic absenteeism. Schools are collecting daily attendance data, but unless they are carefully looking at who are the students who are frequently absent, and we define chronic absenteeism often as missing 10% of the school year, they're going to miss the highest leverage use of that data, right? If you get a 90 on a quiz, that's good. If you get a 90 for attendance, that means you missed a month of school, right? But we wouldn't know that if we were only looking at average daily attendance. So part of it is marshaling that data. We see the same challenge in higher ed. Georgia State has closed the gap, largely closed the gap in college persistence and graduation for their low-income students and students of color through better advising that is driven by use of data that was already available to them. They bought a computer system to track it, and they hired counselors to use it. And so when you, at Georgia State, when you get a bad midterm grade, your advisor calls you and says, "What's your plan? What are you doing about it?" right? If one of the things Georgia State found is they had a large number of students who registered for the wrong classes every year. Classes that were out of sequence, classes that wouldn't get them closer to graduation. So the advisor calls and says, I saw your course selection for the semester. It doesn't line up with your major. What's your plan? Right? And so that's about leveraging data. They call it, I think they call it intrusive advising. I call it nagging, right? Because it's the thing that I'm going to do for my daughters, right? They would say I already do it. Right? But affluent kids whose parents went to college, are much more likely to do that than first generation, right? You think about some of the data we have in a criminal justice context, which I know you're working on, right? We know that many communities have underutilized the data they have about arrests, about complaints against officers, right? If we look inside of the challenges we have around police violence, we'll find that a disproportionate share of the incidents, I know you see this in the Oakland data, a disproportionate share of the incidents involve a subset of the officers who are frequently involved in the misconduct. And so we have that data, we can put it to use. Now, that also means we have to have police and city contracts that allow that data to be used and so forth. But I would argue there's a lot of data that we have that we're not making good enough use of. But then we also have to be diligent about changing policy obstacles that get in the way of using data effectively, like this student unit record issue in higher ed.
Comment, there's a lot of activity going on around the country in mindfulness training. Hi. There's a lot of activity in the country, mindfulness training for teachers, parents, administrators, and students. And I appreciate if you could comment on it, its success, viability, particularly if any district is truly doing it systematically.
Yeah. So I have not visited any place that is doing it at scale. Certainly my colleague in the administration, Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General, was very interested in this topic and has written about it some. I do think there are places where we're seeing that kind of mindfulness training, meditation training, is actually improving school climate and reducing incidents of student violence on campuses and improving quality of life for students and teachers. We have a lot more data, I think, to gather around how to do it well. One worry I have about the mindfulness work and socio-emotional learning work is the real risk of people rushing to scale programs without data and evidence, or substituting good instruction for fads, right? So if you have mindfulness training, but your math teacher doesn't know math, you're not going to do well in math. And so we've got to make sure that we couple, right, intentionality about the socio-emotional and mental health and well-being of students with strong academics. And I know that's part of the purpose of gatherings like this one. But I'm quite optimistic about it. I also think we're going to see long-term that the mindfulness work outside of a school context has long-term health benefits for people. So I do think there's evidence to be gathered. And then we've got to be disciplined about testing out what's the right professional development and support for teachers and school staff to make sure that's high quality.
There you go. So you mentioned that we cannot make progress until we acknowledge some of the inequities, until we acknowledge our history, our systems and structures that perpetuate racialized outcomes in our educational system. And so can you speak a little bit about any districts or schools that are really demonstrating some success in terms of how you acknowledge, identify these challenges, and then work towards addressing them?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that. We have a new podcast at the Education Trust. I was trying to think about this morning, how am I going to work in the podcast? But this was perfect. So the podcast is done by my colleague Karen Chenoweth, who's written a book, Schools That Succeed, that tells the story of districts that are getting good outcomes for low-income students of color. One of the stories that I particularly like is about Lexington, Massachusetts. And it's the story of the work that Lexington did around their METCO students. And you hear in the podcast an interview with the superintendent who describes what Lexington was doing as institutional racism without intent. And what he argues is that when he became superintendent, he looked at the data, and students of color who were coming to Lexington through the METCO program, their outcomes were nowhere near the outcomes of white kids from Lexington. And kids of color were being disproportionately identified for special ed at a very high rate. And so as he dove into the data with his teachers, what he found was that there were issues of bias that they needed to work on, and that they needed as a community to acknowledge this problem and then work collaboratively to fix it. It was about acknowledging race and racial inequity in their school community. And so the podcast tells the story of how Lexington tackled this. Ron Ferguson, the Kennedy School, is featured in the podcast, commenting about the changes that Lexington made because they had this honest conversation about issues of race. We also see places, the Century Foundation report that I mentioned around school diversity tells the story of districts that are taking on segregation in their schools and trying to figure out how, through changing attendance zones in some cases, creating new school models in some cases, through within school changes and practices that separate kids, some kids in the AP classes, other kids in the remedial classes, they're taking on those issues and that history. So Century Foundation report, our podcast. I think one of the challenges, though, is, and I see this very much in our current political environment, people are reluctant to acknowledge what is hard. And our history around race, it's hard. But the schools we have today are a product of the fact that for hundreds of years in this country, it was illegal for black people to learn to read in order to preserve the institution of slavery. And the institution of slavery was followed by Jim Crow, schools that were inferior by design. And so when you think about how recent that was in our history, it's not surprising that we have the challenges that we do given that history, but we're not going to fix those challenges, we're not going to tackle those challenges unless we acknowledge that the present state is an extension of that history. And we see places around the country that are taking on exclusionary discipline. That can be very uncomfortable for people, right? To have to confront their own issues of bias. And one of the things that I worry about is, because it is hard, we also need to give people support. And so I think about some of the school districts that have tackled exclusionary discipline just by saying, you can't suspend anymore, good luck. As opposed to other districts that have said, we're going to provide professional development and support and counseling services and access to mental health services. And the outcomes are very different because it is so hard for people to engage with. Do we have time for one more? One more. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good morning. I'm a master's student here at I'm a master's student here at Harvard studying policy management, and some of the coursework that we've done, or that I've done, we've talked a lot about funding equity. So specifically around Title I and how the funding formula unintentionally gives smaller, wealthier states more money than larger, wealthier states, and then also studying at the state level the difficulties that states have in being Robin Hood and the incentives that creates at the local level in terms of how they're doing taxes. So can you just talk a little bit about, because these programs you're talking about are all wonderful, but they do require money. Mm-hmm. And we know they work and we want to fund them, but how can we make sure that they can be funded?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of what your question describes is a historical lack of political will around equity and funding. And, you know, in American society, racism is like water. You know, if you have water in your house, it finds the cracks. Racism is like that. So you go back to the 1960s, NAACP, LDF did a report about Title I money not actually getting to low-income students of color. You could write an identical report today about the resources not getting to the students who need them the most. We did a study, our Ed Trust West did a study on California's school finance reform, which was supposed to direct more resources to high needs districts. It did, but then within districts, the resources are being directed to more affluent schools. and not to the highest needs kids. So you're right. The problem is present in the Title I funding structure. The problem is present in the state funding structures and in how districts allocate resources. In fact, you can go to New York City and within blocks have schools that are spending 30% more. Affluent schools that are spending 30% more than low-income schools a few blocks away, partly because of how teachers are assigned and how teacher salaries are accounted for in our school funding systems. But fundamentally, fixing this requires political will. And I would argue this is one of the reasons why the school diversity work is so important. It is hard to imagine a scenario in which you concentrate the poorest students in a subset of schools where those schools are going to get the resources they need. The politics of America generally don't work that way. If you concentrate poor folks of color in one set of schools, it's going to be very unlikely that that set of schools will get adequate resources, and that's our history. Right? The history of segregated schools isn't just about kids not sitting together. It is about systematically depriving schools of resources. I visited a county in Florida, Pinellas County, where at the end of a school deseg order, the school board went about resegregating the school system, concentrating poor students of color in a subset of schools. The Tampa Bay Times did a study on this, a series of articles called Failure Factories, concentrated kids in those schools, and then assigned less resources to those schools. It was basically, it was as though you took the 30 years of Brown implementation and just did them in reverse to get back to the original state of a segregated, inferior set of schools. And they didn't like that I came, and I went with Arnie, I was deputy then, the two of us came. They didn't like that we came and called them out, but what they were doing was wrong. But it's a political will problem. And so I would argue that we need to tackle how school districts are organized, how schools are organized, to make sure that there's political voice. If middle-class white kids are in a school, the school gets more resources. That's just a descriptive fact about American society. And so if we don't have integrated schools, then the political will challenge is even greater to persuade people. But the other argument I make to folks is there are no walls that you can build high enough to protect your kid's future from the future of the kid down the street, or down the road, or in the next town over, or living on a Native American reservation out west. All kids' fates are bound up together. So the other thing is we ought to have the political will, even if we can't get over the diversity question, we ought to have the political will because all of our kids' fates are bound up together. And we need leadership, I'll close on this point, we need leadership that lifts our collective aspirations in that way, that asks us how we can be better as a country and a society. Not that foments division, but asks us how we can be better, how we can be more true to our principles. Thanks so much.